Ladies, gentlemen, and exiles of all ages, every few days I've been stopping to talk about builds for each ascendancy that I think are truly standing out at the sort of pinnacle of strength, the best of the best. And while this is shifting constantly, especially as the developers release patches buffing and nerfing different skills or equipment, and while I'll still be talking about the absolute highest tier build another day, today I wanted to branch off into something a little bit different, which is one build for each ascendancy that is at least capable of doing like tier 15 plus maps, so it's still very strong, but one that is meaningfully different from the proper best builds, another option, essentially another long-term choice showing off more of what each ascendancy is capable of at a high end, as quite often people can get sort of tunnel visioned on the singular most powerful build and miss out on an entirely different playstyle they may enjoy far more that is just slightly less strong. So today is much more about talking about these alternate playstyles that are strong for each ascendancy essentially. As usual as well, I'll be showing builds from other players today who put a lot of time and effort into creating these ideas and then building them up to be as strong as they are. So if you have any interest in using these builds for yourself or have any further questions about the details behind them, we will have the creator on screen in each section, so you can go have a look at them and ask the person who knows the build the best. Starting off then with the warrior and the titan ascendancy, the build that I want to focus on today is Leap Slam, with a hefty focus on scaling area of effect up massively, as well as boosting aftershocks as a mechanic. And then the whole idea of this is that you do maps, you jump around into packs of enemies, they explode in a massive radius around you every time that you leap, then you jump again. It's your classic leap style build. Its area of effect seemingly gets absolutely massive as well, which is sort of crazy. It moves quickly through areas because of the way that Leap Slam functions as a skill, and then you build in Herald of Ash to spread overkill damage through enemies as an ignite. Then for single target, you've got a bleed inflicting rolling slam as your bread and butter, and Hammer of the Gods with second wind so you can use it twice in a row, but with lowered cooldown rate. All in all, this just seems like a lot faster and importantly more comfortable or less janky than using a stampede focus setup for your clearing, which has been dominant at the top even after the recent nerfs. And even if it is definitely missing the single target nukes that the top setups have for Titan, it is capable of clearing tier 16 maps with ease, so it's at the very least a very viable setup to use if you like it more. Next up is the Warbringer, and today I want to show you Thorns. I love Thorns as a concept in ARPGs. They are the epitome of stop hitting yourself in gaming, and you'd think with how one-shotty this game can get sometimes that they wouldn't be all that effective, but surprise surprise, there's at least one Thorns build going on right now for Warbringer that can do up to tier 16 equivalent maps at the very least. It's got over 1,000 Thorns, high crit chance for the Thorns, and a unique that makes Thorns be triggered by all hits. As well, they are using Resonating Shield with the Demolisher support to let you break enemy armor as you approach them, which then through the Scavenged Plating Spirit skill gives you not only bonus armor yourself, but also specifically bonus Thorns every time that you fully break an enemy's armor. For bosses, you can't break their armor quite as quickly for these stacks, but the build focuses on very quickly breaking armor and then consuming the armor breaks so you can build more stacks of Scavenged Plating for the bonus Thorns, even in single target. Outside of that, it focuses on scaling as much either maximum life raw by itself or strength of the stat, which gives you more maximum life, and then also the goal of working around Giant's Blood to hopefully instantly fully break armor with a meaty enough weapon under it, which you can use two-handers in one hand properly, which will then let the Thorns scale extremely quickly if you're breaking the armor that quickly. It's worth mentioning, of course, that this isn't necessarily a speed clearing setup either, that's for sure, but the fact that a pure Thorns-based build is capable of doing the deepest endgame maps is in itself worth talking about in my opinion, even if it doesn't do it all that quickly. After that, let's move on to the sorceress and the Stormweaver ascendancy. 90% or more of the top builds using this ascendancy are all focused around Archmage as a spirit skill, which then makes the build focus on stacking mana and intelligence for big, meaty bonus lightning damage, even from what would normally be cheap spells. And it's just a super common way to build the Stormweaver. That said, today is about exploring power down the road less trodden, at least a little bit, and while this will still use Archmage as a damage engine because you're honestly basically throwing if you're playing Stormweaver without it, the actual core gameplay is very different from the standard Spark Archmage. Instead, the core interaction in here is Lightning Warp, which teleports you into enemies to call them if they are low enough health, or into your own ball lightning for movement. This creates an explosion and drops shocked ground on the floor, which applies shock to enemies for bonus damage. You use ball lightnings as well with Scattershot for bonus projectiles and deceleration to keep them actually in range of your enemies, not only applying more shocks but also giving you targets to warp into. Then you can work in Lightning Conduit, which consumes shocks from your enemies to basically just one-shot the whole screen in front of you after each teleportation. It's not quite as insta-giving as Spark Archmage build is, especially for bosses, but it is a close second contender for the Ascendancy with a very different sort of playstyle and flair to it. After that, then we have the Chronomancer with the sort of non-best choice for the ascendancy being double Cast on Freeze Comet, which is still extremely good, capable of clearing tier 15 maps without a problem, and this takes advantage of 2 separate Cast on Freeze Spirit Gems with Comet loaded into them, then using Frostbolt to trigger it, with Scattershot, which makes it fire 2 bonus projectiles per cast, Wild Charge, which makes it have a chance to fire off a load of them in a circle as well, and then some cast speed and bonus freeze buildup, and helping them trigger the absolute storm of comets from multiple instances of Cast on Freeze being active at the same time. This also takes advantage of the Ascendancy nodes that give you the ability to pop back in time and restore your mana for after a massive storm of comets rains down, as that can be quite expensive, and then also the Time Freeze Ascendancy skill, which can put all nearby enemies into stasis on command to let you just set up a crazy storm raining down on top of a large group all at once. The single target is the weak point of this build, but it's more than enough for map bosses, and the actual clear potential walking through tier 15s and above is quite strong in itself, even if it is a little bit squishy. Moving on then, we have the mercenary class with the Witchhunter Ascendancy, and this has a couple of relatively high tier sort of meta setups, but this one is slightly off the beaten track with a combination of Glacial Bolt and Fragmentation rounds at the core of the mapping setup. Glacial Bolt applies heavy chill and freeze buildup, as well as creating ice crystals in front of you too. These ice crystals explode to damage enemies either when bonked by big strong enemies themselves, or if you pop them yourself manually with something like Fragmentation rounds. You then put a lot of effort into Area of Effects as a concept to increase the size of these explosions. You use Herald of Ice to cause shattering enemies to make further chain explosions and do a ton of damage and explode further enemies, clearing out most of the enemies in mapping content by itself. And then for single target, you default to some lightning skills but with a fun twist, specifically using Flame Wall to apply a low level ignite to a boss, then Plasma Blast to apply shock consistently, with the Stormfire support which makes shocks applied to ignited enemies never expire, and then just spamming Shock Burst rounds, which does tons of bonus damage per hit to an enemy that is afflicted by a lightning based ailment, such as this permanent shock. The single target is a bit similar to some other very strong Witchhunter builds that actually focus around lightning damage, but the actual clear setup is quite different from most Witchhunter builds, and I thought that would be fun to share with you all. Then we have the Gemling Legionnaire, and while stat stacking Gemling builds have been gaining a lot of power and popularity as of late, the vast majority of these focus around the Pillar of the Caged God unique quarterstaff, and then just whacking Tempest Bell for insane single target damage on top of that. But this variation of that concept changes a lot of the core concept by building it around the Death's Harp unique bow instead. This gives you a ton of bonus projectiles per projectile skill used, to the point where you can get like 5 or 6 lightning rods every time that you fire lightning rod, because this works off of a similar engine to the main Deadeye setups, which is lightning rod for the main actual damage output, then triggered by high frequency lightning chains to proc the explosions. The main unique at the core of this is the Hand of Wisdom and Action unique gloves, which gives stacking lightning damage on every attack, and it scales with your intelligence. You stack loads of intelligence to then funnel through this, and then each lightning rod proc kicks like a mule after a good spanking. The lightning rod's initial landing does a ton of damage and applies shocks, and then you've got Ball Lightning in a cast on shock spirit gem as well, which will then trigger mass procs from lightning rod every time that it goes off. And for bossing, you grab Orb of Storms to trigger off of your lightning rods, throwing out chaining lightning into all of them, which will then cause super frequent shocks, leading to cast on shock, firing out the Ball Lightning, which causes more chain lightning effects to proc the lightning rods, and everything just melts. It works beautifully. Essentially, this is a halfway point between the strongest Deadeye build and the strongest Gemling build, but it's a very interesting playstyle variation that lands somewhere in the middle while taking advantage of a very underutilized unique weapon. Moving on then, we have the Ranger class, starting with the Deadeye Ascendancy, which has almost entirely been built around lightning rod in all of the main most powerful builds, but this is an extremely strong Deadeye build focused instead around cold damage, and specifically Ice Shot as an ability. It focuses heavily on freezing enemies, applying critical hits, and then shattering them to create explosions through Herald of Ice as a spirit skill. The main combo is Ice Shot by itself with the shattering through Herald of Ice for mapping, and then cast on critical, firing off Eye of Winter to apply the crit weakness debuff to your enemies, making them easier to get critical hits against, which just increases your damage in general, but also makes it easier to trigger your next cast on critical to fire off more Eye of Winters. And then you also have Comet in here too on your cast on critical for some burst damage, and for single target specifically, you work in Tornado Shot to launch off with the Overabundance support inside of it to let you have 2 tornado shots active at the same time as well. And then just Combat Frenzy generating charges to use Rain of Arrows to cause a rain of critical hits to help trigger cast on crit even more frequently. It may not be quite as insane as Lightning Rod Deadeye, but it's extremely impressively strong and a totally different way of looking at this ascendancy too. After that then we have the Pathfinder, and while the general top builds for this ascendancy are purely based around either poison stacking or poison concoction with, well, the poison stacking as well, there's another strong build for the ascendancy worth talking about, which yes does still have poison in its core, before, but instead of gas arrow for gas arrow's sake, it takes advantage of the Radiant Grief unique helmet, which auto-ignites enemies that are nearby you, making the gas arrows instantly pop and explode into a detonation when this happens. Combining this with things like the support that boosts damage of gas arrow itself against ignited enemies, then using Shattering Concoction, which is the cold damage and freeze buildup concoction, and building the mapping around Herald of Ice and Herald of Thunder, creating what is essentially a tri-element Pathfinder build in a very unique and unusual way of doing it. It's definitely not quite as high top-end potential as a pure poison setup, as that is the main thing Pathfinder is built to synergize with, but there is still quite a bit of synergy in here, and it clearly has no issues clearing through maps or with killing bosses either, and it's a very different take on how this ascendancy can feel to play as well. Next up then we have the Monk and the Invoker ascendancy, and a lot of the builds for this are based around similar concepts, but probably the most unique feeling one clearing high-end content is Flicker Strike, with the most interesting variation I've seen using 2 sets of the Cast on Freeze Spirit skill, as well as the Call of the Brotherhood unique ring to turn all lightning damage into cold damage for the build 2 to enable these Cast on Freezes. For Path of Exile 1 veterans who know the old Flicker Strike, you probably look at this and think that it looks slow, but for those who didn't see or experience that, Flicker Strike in Path of Exile 2 is still an incredibly fast and fun ability. The main issue that the build has is, though, to use Flicker Strike effectively, you need power charges, so you have to spend the time generating charges in between each Flicker Strike, as it is specifically built to not allow you to gain power charges during Flicker Strike. This build works around that, though, through a combination of Profane Ritual inside of Cast on Freeze, which generates power charges from dead enemies, and then also Siphoning Strike to manually generate power charges from shocked enemies. You then specifically shock enemies through a combination of Cast on Freeze, also proccing Lightning Warp, the sorceress skill that places shocked ground down on the ground after teleporting either into an enemy or to a Ball Lightning. You also put Ball Lightning in the same Cast on Freeze as Lightning Warp, as well as Eye of Winter to apply crit weakness to enemies, and then you just take the Ascendancy node that gives you a chance to create shocked ground whenever you shock an enemy for Invoker. That's how you apply shocks despite turning all lightning damage into cold, and then outside of that it is the relatively standard build up charges by freezing enemies to trigger your various sources, and then using Flicker Strike to spend the charges on Blink around the place, just slapping everything in the face. Next up then we have the Acolyte of Chayula ascendancy, and this one is a bit tougher, to be honest, for this type of thing, as this is probably the most underplayed ascendancy in the game, and so a lot of the time you just see people playing builds which are generally good regardless of your ascendancy. That said, today we'll be showing off one of those, but a slightly different one, which is Ice Strike focused Acolyte of Chayula, using Shattering Palm to stick a bunch of ice shards into your enemies, smacking them with Ice Strike for loads of damage and to spread the shards, and then classic Herald of Ice while mapping to turn these shattered frozen enemies from Ice Strike into bombs that then blow up anything nearby them, then using Combat Frenzy to generate frenzy charges on freeze, the Resonance Keystone passive to turn the frenzy charges into power charges, and then Charge Staff to actually use these to increase your damage as well. This isn't a necessarily unusual build by any means, but it's one that we haven't talked about, and applying it to Acolyte of Chayula with the Ascendancy nodes to give you a chance for bonus damage as chaos damage, and some extra general chaos resistance too isn't bad at all. Or you can work it around the Flames of Chayula instead for general buffs popping down as you go, but let's be honest, a lot of the actual Ascendancy nodes for Acolyte of Chayula make it good at these non-class specific type builds. Moving on to our last class then, beginning with the Infernalist Ascendancy, all the talk is about summon raging spirits or skeletal reavers or detonate dead, but not enough is at all about being said about skeletal frost mage focused builds. Honestly, the big thing that makes Infernalist capable of what it is a combination of being able to stack a ridiculous amount of energy shield, which then ends up doubled by Grim Feast as a spirit skill, though most classes can take advantage of that idea. Infernalist does it especially well through being an intelligence based class, making energy shield stacking on equipment a lot more approachable and simpler, but then an Ascendancy node gives you bonus maximum energy shield per maximum life that you have, which then lets you scale a bunch of flat energy shield under all of the increases you can get from the passive tree, and then to synergize with that you also have the Ascendancy node that gives you bonus spirit per maximum life that you have too, and so you build energy shield for tankiness, you build maximum life for tankiness too, but that also becomes more energy shield and becomes more spirit as well, and more spirit means more minions, which means more damage too. Then you work around skeletal frost mages as a base and build for cold damage in general. You can boost the projectiles that these minions summon, you can work in hypothermia to lower enemy cold resistance, frostbomb to apply cold exposure as well separately on top of that, then Eye of Winter to give the enemies a stacking debuff that increases your chance of critically hitting them, and even the classic Pain Offering to give a big boost in not only damage but also attack and cast speed for your minions as well. Then finally today, let's talk about the Blood Mage, and this is in a very interesting spot. It went from having some issues with the balancing of its early ascendancy nodes to ending up being the basis of some of the most powerful builds that currently exist in the game. The top one among these is of course the crazy mix of Temporalists and Choir of the Storms that no regular player will ever be able to get for themselves. But if you are looking for something that gets the job done using this ascendancy for far cheaper, the best thing that I've seen going around is Detonate Dead. We have talked about Detonate Dead Blood Mage before in the past, but with the top build for the ascendancy sort of shifting, it has moved this into the slot that fits being what this video is all about. Fun and different builds from the top build, but still very strong. The core concept here is taking advantage of Blood Mage getting access to the unique minion nodes that only exist on the passive tree if you are the witch-based class, but then taking that to a place where you can use the minions to create damage, rather than using the minions as the main damage themselves. Infernalist excels at making minions do damage. Blood Mage instead has some fun niches in the middle where it uses minions for things like Pain Offering, but then brings out the Brute minion with its massive health pool, and then pops Detonate Dead on that for a massive burst of damage. And you don't even need to pop the Brute specifically for most mapping either, just for actual bossing where it can fully one-shot with this ability, one press, coming a long way from the early struggles that this ascendancy did face. That just about does it for today then everyone, a discussion about one build for each ascendancy that isn't quite at the very top slot, but is still extremely powerful and meaningfully different, and interesting enough that if you think the best build for your ascendancy isn't really exciting to you, maybe one of these might grab your attention instead. Again, feel free to check out the original creators for each build if you are interested in learning more. Otherwise, like if you like the video, subscribe to the notification bell for more, and most importantly, ladies and gentlemen, until next time, stay sweet.
Josh, Cotton, and Hollow with the videos, dropping the humor like a hammer on your tippy toes, bringing entertainment on a daily arrangement to take our insanity and turn it into entertainment. Yes, I said entertainment twice, to reiterate that it is nice to look into your faces on a mostly daily basis when you let us in your homes to make the whole world a stage. Goodbye.